The air hung heavy in the room, thick with the scent of stale cigarettes. It was a smell that seemed to have seeped into the very walls, a permanent reminder of countless travelers who had passed through, each leaving a piece of their story behind. The room was a time capsule of forgotten lives, a silent witness to the hopes and despairs of those who had sought refuge within its four walls. The flickering neon sign outside cast a sickly yellow glow across the water-stained ceiling, its incessant buzzing a constant reminder of the world outside. The sign, once a beacon of welcome, now seemed to mock the very idea of comfort. It was as if the motel itself was aware of its own decay, and the sign was its way of acknowledging the passage of time and the erosion of dreams. John sank onto the edge of the bed, its springs groaning in protest. The bed, much like the room, had seen better days. It creaked under his weight, a sound that echoed the weariness in his bones. He had been driving for hours, the endless stretch of highway offering little in the way of solace. The bed, uncomfortable as it was, represented a brief respite from the road, a momentary pause in his journey. A sense of unease settled over him, a feeling that he was not alone. The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and changing with the flicker of the neon light. It was as if the room itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed, that unseen eyes were tracking his every move. This motel, this room, felt like a tomb prepared just for him. The peeling wallpaper, the cracked mirror, the threadbare carpet, all of it contributed to the sense of decay and abandonment. It was a place where time stood still, where the past lingered like a ghost, refusing to move on. John couldn't help but feel that he had stepped into a place that was meant to be forgotten, a relic of a bygone era. He placed his worn leather bag on the nightstand, its contents rattling softly. The bag was a constant companion, a repository of his life on the road. It held everything he needed, and yet, in this moment, it felt woefully inadequate. The room seemed to swallow the sound, the soft rattle of the bag's contents barely registering in the oppressive silence. It was as if the room was absorbing everything, leaving nothing but an echo of emptiness. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, scratching at the window pane. The sound was eerie, a mournful wail that seemed to resonate with the desolation of the place. It was a reminder of the isolation, the vast emptiness that surrounded the motel. The wind carried with it the whispers of the past, the voices of those who had come before, each one adding to the chorus of despair. He should have kept driving, should have found a brighter place to rest. The decision to stop here at this forsaken motel now seemed like a grave mistake. The highway, with all its uncertainties, suddenly felt like a safer option. But the night had fallen, and with it came a creeping dread that clung to him like a shroud. The darkness outside was impenetrable, a void that offered no escape. Now it was too late. Night had fallen, and with it came a creeping dread that clung to him like a shroud. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were reaching out to him. He felt trapped, ensnared by the very place he had sought refuge in. The sense of foreboding was overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He reached for the lamp, its shade torn and faded, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls. The light it provided was weak, barely enough to pierce the darkness. The shadows it cast were twisted, distorted, like the remnants of a nightmare. They seemed to move with a life of their own, mocking his attempts to find comfort. The lamp, much like everything else in the room, was a relic of the past, a reminder of better days long gone. A chill shot down his spine. He could have sworn he heard a whisper, a faint sigh carried on the wind. It was a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The room, with its oppressive silence, amplified the noise, making it impossible to ignore. He turned, looking over his shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the shadows, the flickering light, and the ever-present sense of unease. His hand trembled as he finally clicked the lamp on, but the meager light did little to chase away the darkness that had already seeped into his soul. The room remained shrouded in shadows, the light only serving to highlight the decay and neglect. It was a futile gesture, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of despair. The darkness was not just in the room, it was within him, a reflection of his own inner turmoil. John tried to ignore the growing unease. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the dim light of a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, memories of better days now tainted by the present's grim reality. He grabbed a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his bag, lit one, and inhaled deeply. The familiar burn of nicotine filled his lungs, a temporary distraction from the gnawing anxiety. He watched the smoke curl upwards, dissipating into the stale air, and wondered how he had ended up in this forsaken place. The nicotine did little to calm his nerves. Each drag only seemed to heighten his awareness of the oppressive silence, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that he was on the brink of discovering a truth he wasn't ready to face. He glanced at the TV in the corner, its screen dark and lifeless. It was an old model, the kind that hadn't been in production for decades. Dust covered its surface, a testament to its long disuse. Yet despite its inert appearance, it seemed to hold a sinister presence, as if it were waiting for the right moment to spring to life. A relic from another era, just like this entire forsaken motel. The walls were peeling, the furniture worn and threadbare. It was a place that had seen better days, now reduced to a ghost of its former self. John couldn't help but feel a kinship with the decaying building, both of them trapped in a state of disrepair. A sudden crackle from the TV jolted him upright. The sound was jarring, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. His heart raced as he stared at the screen, which now flickered with static. It was as if the TV had come to life of its own accord, responding to some unseen command. He watched, transfixed, as the screen flickered to life, a chaotic dance of static filling the silence. The patterns on the screen seemed almost hypnotic, drawing him in with their erratic movements. He felt a strange compulsion to keep watching, unable to tear his eyes away from the mesmerizing display. A wave of cold washed over him. It was an unnatural chill, seeping into his bones and making him shiver uncontrollably. The temperature in the room seemed to drop suddenly, as if the very air around him had turned to ice. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to ward off the freezing sensation. He hadn't touched the remote, hadn't even plugged the damn thing in. The power cord lay on the floor, disconnected from any source of electricity. Yet the TV continued to emit its eerie static, defying all logic and reason. It was as if the device were possessed, operating under its own mysterious power. The only sound now was the incessant buzzing from the television, a low hum that vibrated in his teeth. It was a maddening noise, relentless and grating. He could feel it reverberating through his skull, a constant reminder of the unnatural events unfolding before him. The sound seemed to grow louder with each passing second, amplifying his sense of dread. His fingers tightened around his cigarette, the glowing ember burning dangerously close to his skin. He barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the bizarre spectacle on the TV screen, the static forming shapes and patterns that seemed almost deliberate. It was as if the static were trying to communicate with him, to convey some hidden message. The buzzing grew louder, morphing into a high-pitched whine that seemed to bore into his skull. The sound was unbearable, a piercing shriek that made him wince in pain. He clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The sound seemed to penetrate his very being, resonating deep within his mind. He tried to look away, to break free from the hypnotic pull of the screen, but some unseen force held him captive. His eyes were glued to the flickering static, unable to move. It was as if the TV had cast a spell on him, trapping him in its thrall. He felt a growing sense of panic, his heart pounding in his chest as he struggled to regain control. He felt a scream rising in his throat, but no sound came out. His mouth opened in a silent cry, his vocal cords paralyzed by fear. The terror was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him from all sides. He could feel his sanity slipping away, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring into one. He was paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating grip of the impossible. His body refused to obey his commands, frozen in place by an unseen force. He could only watch in helpless horror as the static on the screen seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a malevolent presence that filled the room with its dark energy. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air growing thin and cold. The walls closed in, pressing down on him with an almost tangible weight. He struggled to breathe, each gasp of air feeling like a desperate fight for survival. The once familiar room had transformed into a claustrophobic nightmare, a prison from which there was no escape. The buzzing reached a fever pitch, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the cacophony that had filled the room moments before. John blinked, disoriented, as the TV screen went black. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift, leaving him in a state of bewildered confusion. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. The room was still. The only sound, the faint hum of the light bulb overhead. John sat there, his mind reeling from the inexplicable events he had just witnessed. The sense of unease lingered, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. He knew that whatever had happened was just the beginning, and the true horror was yet to come. John stared at the television, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light being the flickering screen in front of him. He'd always been fascinated by the old TV, a relic from a bygone era, but tonight it felt different. There was an unsettling energy in the air, a sense of foreboding that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The static remained, a blizzard of white noise against the black screen. It was as if the television was trying to communicate, to break through the barrier of time and space. John couldn't tear his eyes away, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it a glitch or something more sinister? The static seemed to pulse with a life of its own, drawing him deeper into its chaotic embrace. Then slowly, shapes began to emerge from the chaos. Faces pale and twisted, with eyes that burned like hot coals. They seemed to be reaching out to him, their expressions a mix of agony and desperation. John felt a chill run down his spine as he realized these were not just random images. They were trying to tell him something, to convey a message from beyond the grave. Their mouths moved, but he heard no sound, only the blood rushing in his ears. It was as if the television was a window to another world, a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. John leaned in closer, his breath fogging up the screen. He could almost feel their pain, their anguish, as if it were his own. He leaned closer, mesmerized and horrified in equal measure. The faces seemed to grow clearer, more defined, as if they were coming into focus. He could see the details of their features, the lines etched into their skin, the hollow look in their eyes. It was as if they were trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and he was their only hope of escape. The whispers started as a barely audible murmur, like wind through dead trees. At first, John thought it was just his imagination, a trick of the mind. But as the whispers grew louder, he realized they were real. They seemed to be coming from the television, a chorus of voices blending together in a haunting melody. It was a sound that chilled him to the bone, a sound that spoke of things best left forgotten. Gradually, they grew louder, clearer, weaving a tapestry of horror that chilled him to the bone. The voices were filled with anguish, with a raw terror that transcended language. John could feel their fear, their desperation, as if it were his own. It was a feeling that gnawed at his soul, a feeling that he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't make out the words, but the voices were filled with anguish, with a raw terror that transcended language. They spoke of unspeakable pain, of blood and darkness, of souls trapped in eternal torment. John felt a sense of dread wash over him as he realized he was not just a spectator, he was a participant in their suffering. They spoke of unspeakable pain, of blood and darkness, of souls trapped in eternal torment. The images on the screen grew more vivid, more horrifying, as if they were trying to break free from their static prison. John could see the blood, the darkness, the twisted forms of the damned. It was a vision of hell, a vision that threatened to consume him whole. Their voices seemed to claw at his mind, trying to break free from their static prison and drag him down into the abyss. John felt a pressure building in his head, a pressure that threatened to burst his skull. He could feel their hands, their cold, clammy hands, reaching out to him, trying to pull him into their world. It was a feeling of utter helplessness, a feeling that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the images and the voices, but it was no use. They were inside his head now, a chorus of the damned chanting his name. John could feel their presence, their cold, clammy presence, as if they were standing right next to him. It was a feeling of utter terror, a feeling that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. They were inside his head now, a chorus of the damned chanting his name. He could hear their voices, their haunting voices, echoing in his mind. It was a sound that he couldn't escape, a sound that threatened to drive him mad. John felt a sense of panic rising in his chest as he realized he was losing control. He was no longer in control of his own mind, his own thoughts. He stumbled back from the TV, knocking over the lamp. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the flickering screen. John could feel his heart racing, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of madness. He could feel the darkness closing in, the cold, suffocating darkness that threatened to consume him whole. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. But the faces on the screen remained, illuminated by their own internal fire, their silent screams echoing in the sudden silence. John could see their eyes, their burning eyes, staring at him with a mix of anger and desperation. It was a sight that he couldn't escape, a sight that haunted his every waking moment. But the faces on the screen remained, illuminated by their own internal fire, their silent screams echoing in the sudden silence. John could feel their presence, their cold, clammy presence, as if they were standing right next to him. It was a feeling of utter terror, a feeling that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. He was trapped, his sanity unraveling at the seams, teetering on the precipice of a madness from which there was no return. He was trapped, his sanity unraveling at the seams, teetering on the precipice of a madness from which there was no return. John could feel the darkness closing in, the cold, suffocating darkness that threatened to consume him whole. He was on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of madness. He could feel the darkness closing in, the cold, suffocating darkness that threatened to consume him whole. It was a feeling of utter helplessness, a feeling that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried.